Speaking of reasonable people and reasonable ideas and risk mitigation, I've picked up the Ninja Turtles game stream, which now means it is time for Questionable Ideas, our tabletop exercise where our panelists will step in as interim executives with the fictional company known as Questionable Ideas. These scenarios, which may or may not be over the top, will relate to today's topic. The panelists have not seen these scenarios in advance, and they are not responsible for the presence of goblins, gremlins, or kobolds in these scenarios. That is entirely my fault. And let's lay out the ground rules again. With this, both Sebastian and Grant will have the same rights and privileges that they have within their organizations and whatever additional resources they may need to call in to address the scenarios that are being presented to them. The goblins represent the fast-moving, let's just do things as quickly as possible. This seems like a shiny new bit of technology. Let's plug it in kind of ID. The kobolds represent more stoic, stay kind of approach to technology. And the gremlins are, well, they're just chaos. They say, why not break things and see how things work afterwards or not? Again, since both of you are CTOs, you will be co-CTOs, interim co-CTOs for Questionable Ideas. Grant, Sebastian, are you ready?
Ready. Yes.
All right. First scenario. Questionable Ideas is undergoing a migration to a new environment with all the cloud, AI, digital resources you could ask for. The goblins handled the stress test of the applications under their go very fast principles. Workloads seem to scale properly and latency is low until a few weeks pass and reconciliation jobs fail. There are conflict reports from downstream analytics and query performances are imploding. The goblins promise the data is clean, but it turns out they only used recently standardized data and issues arose when legacy data was accessed. How do you resolve this? The goblins claim the legacy data won't matter because the company is forward-looking.
Yeah, I can definitely start. Definitely cannot just use the standardized data from that perspective. So we're going to have to go back and either take a sample of the legacy data or take the legacy data itself in a parallel system and run that through those data integrity pipelines and have the proper checks in place to see again if there's any type of message degradation, any type of ETL issues as we bring that through and stress and press test that in the actual production system in a lower environment to see what the real issues almost going to start from scratch from that testing process and make sure that if we didn't test it with the legacy data or a sampling of that legacy data, then a very high probability that we're going to see some issues downstream in production analytic systems.
I mean, the goblins promise that everything's going to be moving forward and they're only looking to the future. Sebastian, what are your thoughts on how to address this additionally?
There's the immediate problem of dealing with data and reports and reconciliation that doesn't work. And then there's, which can be addressed, as Greg pointed out. And then there's the operational or the organizational problem where a group responsible for a key function did not have the proper outlook when it came to mitigating risk. And so this is an opportunity where you have a conversation, you explain what your expectations are, what the priority is. And hopefully it's just a conversation where you reset the baseline and then you kind of move forward from there with a new understanding. Now, if you're actually dealing in a scenario where people are, like just really total goblin mode, where they're like, no, we're young and crazy. We want to go fast, fast, fast. It's like, you haven't had enough lawsuits yet. So you will quickly learn to see things differently after some pain. But that being said, the CTO's job is to protect the organization, particularly from the highly motivated, highly intelligent, people that just are go-getters and they're crazy. It's not that they're bad. It's that, the organization needs both the goblins and the kobolds to kind of counterbalance each other. And you should actually have processes in place that essentially require executive overview to actually just basically say, this is a supercritical system. For example, it's medical data, lives are at risk. We have a standard way of doing things. The FDA has certain requirements and things like that. But I want you to present your plan to me. And it's not necessarily that I am the best person I'm not necessarily the subject matter expert on that particular thing. But if they cannot explain it in such a way that actually it makes sense, because one of the things that people, and Greg and in my own role, one of our jobs is pattern recognition, looking for human behavior and things like that, overconfidence. And we will actually just I want to hear them explain the idea to me. I want to hear the thought process. I can tell when the thought process is errant or has gaps. And I want to go through that whole flow by having those checkpoints in your process after you've dealt with the immediate data. What you end up doing is instilling this instilling this mentality within the organization that people care. It's important that you take things seriously, and you won't necessarily be rewarded just by finishing fast. You also have to finish at the expected quality.
Well, the goblins will definitely require some training
Yeah.
to understand, quality over moving fast, since that is, in their
And
blood.
maybe
What
some
they do.
compliance training as well.
Well, compliance is another issue with them because they
Yeah.
allegedly may or not have kidnapped the CFO a couple of episodes ago. Okay. All right. Scenario 2. Security team at Questionable Ideas comes to both of you with a red alert. They have caught a series of fraud attempts by an outside bad actor. The problem is the fraud detection system should have spotted this in theory. It was designed and tested by the kobolds for this very purpose. Upon closer inspection, it seems the kobolds used highly sanitized synthetic data that they call the pristine garden. And they based that on very dated data samples. And the fraud detection system was very successful in testing largely because of that predictability. How do you recalibrate this testing process?
Sure. Start with that one as well. I mean, obviously, the first step we're going to go through is make sure that we've remediated and stopped the fraud attempt. But you're talking about the testing procedures from that perspective. So again, I think it's a perfect example of what you've got of having your data is too good or looking at your golden data set from that perspective. So it's sitting back and looking at, how do they penetrate? What are all the out of bounds scenarios that we need to look at from that perspective? How do we bring all of the data aspects back into that testing plan? It's a lot what Sebastien talked about as well. Sitting down and kind of reviewing that plan from end to end, even though you're not maybe the subject matter expert, looking at it through that lens of what's the logical outsider view that you could put on this as well. What was the logic that the fraudster used that we didn't use, right? That's one of the things. What were our blind spots? How do we look at it from we maybe are too much of a subject matter expert and someone who looks at it from an outside view from that perspective. And you can look at your entire security program that way, as well as your data aspects of it, to look at it to say, how do we look at this from a different perspective, and what perspective do they use to introduce that? How do I take those lessons learned, bring them back in that same type of cultural mentality to kind of build those scenario testers out, the data sets that we use to do those scenario testing, to make sure that our fraud detection is truly where it needs to be from that perspective. And it's instilling as well kind of a continuous process of that. So whatever falls out, that you're kind of learning from those and building those back into your testing scenarios. Because the one thing that we know specifically from our seat in the healthcare space is that there is always a new avenue to find a different way around the existing processes and procedures. So how are you testing for future-proofing those against fraudulent behavior?
Sebastien, your thoughts on the pristine garden approach that the kobolds had introduced?
That is not good. Because there's a type of person, really smart people that like solving puzzles. They get their whole goal in life, because they see the security system, right, as a challenge. It's like, okay, this is a system that was deliberately built to thwart me. I wonder if I can be the smarter bear and break through anyways. And, sometimes it's just the thrill of breaking through. Sometimes they're trying to get money kind of thing, like a reimbursement system. And so if you go with, given that their mentality is the exact opposite of a rule follower, testing your system with data that follows the rules basically accomplishes something. It does functional testing, but it certainly doesn't do security testing. And so when you approach testing, because oddly enough, people actually try to attack SSDs to force them to run code that is not appropriate, or to do inappropriate things with data, or to bypass security protocols and things like that. So, and these people are the kind of people that will spend months. An employee will not spend months on a problem because they have a schedule, a deadline, and things like that, right? So it is really beneficial, particularly if your data's or your system, whatever it is highly sensitive, to actually have a team whose whole purpose is to try to break in. And so, and not any, you can't just assign any random engineer to this. You have to assign people that have a predisposition to just getting a kick out of messing things up, kind of thing. And so the more aggressive you test your system, both with basic positive and negative testing and out of bounds testing, but you should also do a type of testing which is called fuzz testing. And so when you're fuzzing, what you're basically doing is not only are you not following the rules, but you're not following the protocol rules. And you're like setting bits incorrectly. You're doing things in an odd order. You try to do them quickly, or potentially you try to do them after some, timeout thing has tried to log you out. But maybe that mechanism only kind of logs you out, but you still have access to some pages. Like, so by going through the positive, the negative, the white box, some black box, and the randomized fuzz testing, that is a methodology that can allow you to explore through automation a wide range of scenarios. But then having a team of people who are intelligent and motivated to have experience in breaking things actually attack it in a methodical way that they know other systems sometimes fail can be very beneficial. So everything costs money, everything costs time, but sometimes it's justified given the nature of the industry, and sometimes not so much, right? And this becomes also a business decision.
Breaking things is definitely part of this last scenario because the gremlins have stepped up and it's their turn to mess with things. The gremlins have come to you when they say that the problem with the company's stress testing is that it's just not done with really hard challenges. They say it is time to actively push corrupted historical and training data that includes process bias, undocumented manual overrides, and incomplete event histories into this system. They want to unleash what they are calling the Pompeii protocol, which would crater the data integrity across the company in the process and require an extensive rebuild. But it would expose issues, at least as far as they are seeing it. Do you let the gremlins unleash Pompeii in a very unsystematic way?
Yeah, absolutely not. Certainly not in your production systems. I think, perfect example for us to create a sandbox environment, a replication of that environment. I think there's some very credible aspects to what they may be proposing that could be actually very useful, but let's do them in a more contained, safe environment, away from production disruption, what that could have on the effect of our customers, our patients. Again, in our world, these are actually life-changing events that we're doing. So we've got to be extremely careful. We're highly regulated. We've got to stay within those boundaries. But there could be a lot of very interesting things, what we talked about on the previous conversation of really using this as a place to kind of test the limits. But let's do it in a safe environment. Let's do it in a replicated environment. Let's do it in a way that we can also monitor those results, bring those results back in so that we can understand how to then kind of migrate those to a production environment. But absolutely, let's do it in a safe, protected environment.
Sebastien, your input on how to deal with the gremlins in their Pompeii protocol.
Yeah, the concept is very good. But this is where, the organizational aspect comes in. To Greg's point, you do not test a live system. Now, here's the trouble, because we're all human, right? And let's say that we're friends with one of the gremlins. We just get along naturally, right? So their words are going to have more sway on us, potentially. And so, and this guy or girl, this person is very, very persuasive, great speaker. And this individual has the speech and says, what could possibly be more realistic than the real environment? You can't get more real than real. And that's where you put your foot down and you say, no, because at the end of the day, let's say that we do this and people die. You can't reset that. Or we do this and people lose a lot of money. Maybe their life savings gets wiped away or their health insurance policy disappears. They're no longer in the system. That is completely unacceptable. And that could cause permanent reputational damage to the organization to the point where you lose all your customers. You go out of business. It doesn't matter if you did the best test conceivable if you cannot continue operations to generate revenue to service your customers, but also to pay your employees, because everybody needs their paycheck. And so to that end, anyone who argues what could be more real than real maybe shouldn't be in a leadership position, because you can absolutely, at the end of the day, if I have two identical systems using two identical copies of the data, but one is processing live incoming customer interactions and the other one is using simulated interactions, and this is where you can use AI, test scripts, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But just because at the low level the server address is slightly different, but everything else is the same, to argue that that's not real enough is amateurish. Nobody with in a senior position would argue that. So let's say these gremlins are arguing that. Well, then in that scenario, you basically, again, have to be, the person who sanity checks their arguments. And then you don't have to necessarily lay down the law, just command things like that, because it generally doesn't work really well with smart people that like to break rules. And so what you really say is, let's have a conversation. Let's say we do this, and and then we actually corrupt all of the data and 7 people die. What is your approach? You make them solve the problem, or at least think it through. Ultimately, what you want to do is get buy-in into what you're proposing, because buy-in is much, much more effective than mandates. With buy-in, people actively use their brains to align with the objective and the priorities of the organization. Whereas with commandment, you're basically telling them, don't think, do what I say. And now you better be really good about thinking about everything, because you've effectively discouraged your team from being creative. And that also doesn't have good outcomes.
Well, you definitely laid the groundwork for good outcomes with those very reasonable sanity checks laid out for the gremlins and also for the other elements of questionable ideas. All right. Well, Sebastian, Grant, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. You have definitely shared some great insights and great guidelines for dealing with some, how to approach stress testing, and also some wacky ideas that might come up with people who think they're going to be helpful, but actually potentially causing the damage. So I appreciate you both for coming on today.
Thank you for having us.
Pleasure, JP. Thank you so much.